computer. All right. So here we are, ready to start the last chapters of Genesis. And as always, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And we will start with Genesis. Well, we'll start with the review like we always do. And let's go to the slideshow. All right, so after a tough start, we're on to Genesis, chapters 26 through 50. And a quick review from last week. We've got that little bit of limerick that I talked about before, the creation, fall, flood, nations. That was what we covered the first week. Creation when God made us, the fall when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, the flood when Noah built the ark and started things all over again, and nations, which is when speech was confused and at the Tower of Babel. And so then last week we started talking about Abraham and his trip from Ur all the way down to Canaan, to the promised land around the Dead Sea, the Galilee. And we said that God was talking to Abraham. He called this pagan and called him to himself. And he told Abraham he was going to make him a great nation. He was going to give him a great name. In other words, lots of descendants and blessings for the nations. And we talked about Sarah and Hagar, of course. Sarah didn't really believe God because she was old. So she gave Hagar, her maid, to Abraham, and he had a baby with her called Ishmael. And then Sarah actually did have a baby, Isaac. And we talked about how God made circumcision the sign of this covenant that he made with Abraham. Then we talked about Isaac, Sarah's and Abraham's baby, and how he was a type of Christ, how Abraham was asked to sacrifice him, and Isaac carried the wood of the cross, or the wood of his sacrifice on his shoulder, like Christ carried the cross, and how ultimately he was saved from the sacrifice by the angel of the Lord, who grabbed Abraham's hand and made him stop. And so Abraham's faith proved him to be a righteous man. And then we talked about Isaac married Rebecca, and he and Rebecca had 2 children. That was where we left off at, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob was the second born of the twins. Esau was the firstborn and should have gotten everything. The firstborn was very important back then, but Esau sold his birthright to Jacob. Esau was a guy of the wilderness, a guy of the outdoors. Jacob was a quiet guy, but a schemer, and he got Esau to sell his birthright for essentially a bowl of stew. And so that was where we left off in the story, but I want to talk about one other thing. Dewey and I were talking after the class. She asked me a question about, what about all these wild ages that are in the Bible? And most theologians, I said, consider those ages to be symbolic. The church doesn't take a stance on it, but most theologians will say those are symbolic numbers. And part of the reason that they say that they're symbolic is because the actual books, first 5 books of the Bible, they're called the Pentateuch, and they are attributed to Moses. And when I was talking to Dewey, and also I noticed, I said it in class, Abraham was making his trip from Ur down to the promised land, down to Canaan, around 1800 before Christ. And I kept saying to everybody that Moses came about 1,000 years later. That's not true. Moses actually came about 400 years later, which was around 1400 BC. And he would have been the first to write down the happenings that of those first 5 books of Genesis. And imagine what would happen if somebody 400 years from now was to record the history of the United States, right? Things would have come down through talking, and they would get written down by Moses. And of course, we talked before about how there was the divine part of the Bible, and then there's man's input to the Bible, which has been approved by God. But God, lets them come up with reasons for why people are named the way they are, or places are named the way they are. And of course, when Moses is writing from 400 years away, he's remembering these names that he's heard, Abraham and the stories about creation. So that's how you get things that don't seem to really join up, that seem out of place in those in the Old Testament. It's because of that lag in between when things happened and when they got written down. And then remember, even after they're written down, the papyrus and the vellum keeps wearing out, so scribes are rewriting it, and they have the ability to, like, oh, I know the name of this place now, and add the name of a place. So anyway, I just wanted to make that clear to everybody. Dewey and I talked about it a little bit, but now we've all talked about it a little bit. So jumping back into chapter 26, Isaac and Abimelech. Isaac is now facing famine again. Remember when his father Abraham came down from Ur, he actually went to Egypt first because there was a big famine. And then he came back up to Shechem and Bethel and the places around the Dead Sea. And so Isaac is looking at this famine again. And so God comes to him, and first of all, he renews the same covenant with Isaac that he had with Abraham. You're going to be a great nation. You're going to have a great name. You're going to be a blessing for all nations. And then he's told by God to stay in Canaan, in the land of the Philistines, right? Abraham, what he thought of doing was dropping down into Egypt. But Isaac was probably thinking the same thing, and God said, no, don't do that. You stay here in Canaan, in the land of the Philistines. And we get that story again, only now it's with Rebecca and Isaac. Rebecca is so beautiful that Abimelech will want her. So Isaac says, say you're my sister. And Abimelech has caught on now, though, because Abraham tried that same thing with him with Sarah. And so he immediately gives Rebecca back and says, why did you lie to me? This is your wife. And again, it's that culture trying to make a name for themselves through beautiful, powerful people. And Rebecca is one of those very beautiful people. And God is again faithful to Isaac in giving Rebecca back without any kind of tarnishing of her reputation. And then we're told in chapter 26 that Esau takes Hittite wives. Hittites are pagans. They're Canaanites, right? They live in the land of Canaan. They have many gods, many idols. And that's who Esau chooses his wives from. And it really ticks his parents off. Isaac and Rebecca are mad about it. So then we come back. The morning class is like, I can't believe all the treachery that occurs in the Old Testament. And here's some more treachery. Isaac is now old and he can't see very well, and he knows it's time to give my sons their blessing. And remember, we said Esau, a man of the outdoors, he's Papa's favorite. Jacob is Mama's favorite. Well, Isaac talks to Esau first, and he tells Esau to go out and kill some of my favorite game, make me a savory dish, bring it back to me, and I'll give you your blessing. And Esau heads out to do that. But Rebecca hears the conversation. So she goes to Jacob and she says, go and kill a couple of goats and young ones. So they're going to be savory. She'll make the favorite dish, bring her back these skins, and she'll wrap Jacob's hands in goat skin. You can see in this picture how Jacob has goat gloves on with the hairy side out and a hairy goat piece around his neck. And Jacob is told to go and trick his father. And so he does that. And Isaac is confused, right? He hears the voice of Jacob, but Rebecca has put all of Esau's hunting fine clothes onto Jacob. So Jacob smells like Esau. When Isaac feels his hands, he feels like Esau. And he's got his wife telling him, this is Esau. Give him his blessing. And so Isaac does it. Well, when Esau finds out, he wants to kill Jacob. Which older brother wouldn't? And now Rebecca says to Jacob, you got to go to Laban, to my brother who lives in Haran, because otherwise Esau is going to kill you. But of course, she doesn't want to say that to Isaac, her husband. So in chapter 28, Rebecca convinces Isaac to send Jacob away so he doesn't marry a Hittite woman, right? Esau did that. If you leave Jacob in the land of the Canaanites, Jacob's going to do the same thing. He's going to marry a pagan. And so Isaac tells Jacob to head up to Laban, Rebecca's brother, and to Rebecca's father, and find himself a wife. And meanwhile, while Jacob packs up and starts heading, remember, he's got to go all the way back up to Haran because that's where Laban lives. Esau figures out, Mom and Dad really don't like me marrying these pagan women, so I'm going to marry somebody they'll like better. I'll marry Ishmael's daughter, right? Ishmael is the son of the Egyptian servant Hagar. And so he has a daughter by now. And to get back in his good graces, Esau goes and marries Ishmael's daughter. Meanwhile, Jacob's on his trip. He's headed north to Haran. And he has a dream of a ladder to heaven. And in this dream, he sees the angels of God going up and down this ladder. And I just thought this was an interesting interpretation of it. As you can see, God's angels going up and down this staircase. And in this story, Jacob's now got this ladder to heaven. He comes out of it and he says, I'm going to change the name of Luz. Luz was a pagan sanctuary, a Canaanite sanctuary, and it would have had a ziggurat. Remember those ziggurats I showed you pictures of, how they had those staircases that went up all the way to the top where there was a little parapet that kind of looked like they were going up to heaven. Well, that's what he does. He justifies the name of now Bethel, the house of God, because at this place he has found a ladder that goes up to heaven. And Jacob says to God, if you're good to me, I'll be the one who worships you, right? You give me food, you give me safety, and you help me to flourish, then I'm going to exchange with you my loyalty. And I'll also give you 1/10 of everything I make. So that comes out of Jacob's dream. And this dream, of course, has been put into song in church. We sing, we are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladders, soldiers of the cross. Well, you just read chapter 28. You now know what Jacob's ladder is. So in chapter 29, Jacob, the tricker of Esau, gets tricked himself. Jacob is very much like the story of Rebecca and Rachel is very similar, right? When Isaac needed a wife, Abraham sent his servant, and his servant got to an oasis, and he made a deal with God about how he was going to recognize the best wife for Abraham's son Isaac. Well, this time Jacob has now come to an oasis. He sees guys getting ready to water all their flocks, and he asks them if they know Laban from Haran, and they say, "Oh, we know Laban. Here comes his daughter." And when Jacob sees her, he's smitten, right? He doesn't ask God for signs or anything. He sees this beautiful woman, and he moves the rock off the well, and he waters her flock, and then he kisses her. And then they go to Laban, her father's house. And Laban, we already met back when we were talking about Rebecca, when she went back to her father's house. And so Jacob says he stays for a month, and Laban says, "Well, you can't just work for nothing. What can I give you?" And he says, "Give me Rachel. I want Rachel, and I'll work for you for 7 years if you'll give her to me." And Laban says, "Oh, yeah, you can have Rachel." Well, when the wedding day comes, he gets Jacob drunk, and then he substitutes her older, uglier sister. And it doesn't really say in scripture that she's ugly. It says she has weak eyes. But artists all around have decided that Leah was not very pretty. And so I think she's pretty in this picture. But Rebecca's obviously the one in green, and the one with the long flowing red hair. And Jacob is not very happy when he wakes up in the morning and he finds Leah. And so he gets mad at Laban, and Laban says, "Listen, you can give me 7 more years, and next week I'll give you Rachel. Finish your time with Leah here, and then I'll give you Rachel." So that's what he does. He gives him Rachel for another 7 years. Well, God recognizes that this is not really very fair. That here's Leah, she was the older of the daughters. That was Laban's excuse for why he didn't give Rachel first. He gave Leah because she was older. And Jacob doesn't like her, and God feels sorry for her. So he opens the womb of Leah, and Leah bears Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Those are going to be 4 of the tribes of Israel, right? 4 of the tribes of Israel. And Rachel, the beautiful one, is barren. So that's how chapter 29 ends. And then there's chapter 30. Yikes, those humans. We already saw, what did Sarah do when she was barren? She gave Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant, to Abraham. Well, now we're going to see Rachel do the same thing. And then, so Rachel gives her maidservant Bilhah to Jacob so that Jacob can have children with her. And so Dan and Naphtali are born. And then Leah realizes she's not having babies anymore. So to match Rachel, she gives her maidservant Zilpah to Jacob. And he has 2 sons by her, Gad and Asher. And then we get an interesting story about Leah's son, right? Leah knows that his mom wants to have more babies. She's not having them. So he goes out in the field and he spies some mandrakes. Mandrakes were a fertility drug back then, considered a fertility drug. So he brings these mandrakes back to his mother. Well, Rachel sees them. And Rachel is like, sell me your mandrakes, right? I don't even have a baby. And Leah's like, well, what are you going to give me if I do? And Rachel's like, well, you can sleep with Jacob again. And so she does. And Leah has more children. She adds to the 4 sons she already had, Issachar and Zebulon, and it names a woman. Very unusual in the Old Testament to see women called out. There's really something special about them, some reason why they're put into a text, and we will find out why Dinah's in there. And now God feels sorry for Rachel. And so he opens up her womb and she has a son also. She has Joseph and she finally bears fruit. And then we get an interesting story about Jacob. Now he's got 4 wives, he's got 12 sons, and who knows how many daughters, only Dinah is named. And he's ready to go home. He's ready to go back to Canaan. That's the land that is promised by God. And so he tells Laban, I want to go home. And Laban's like, whoa, what do you want to take with you? And what he says, what can I give you? And of course, that kind of irks Jacob because he's worked all these years for him. He's like, well, you're not giving me anything, but what I have earned, it will be all of the spotted goats and all of the black lambs. Anything that's spotted or black, it's mine. Anything that is white, that's yours, right? And if you ever have seen flocks, almost everything's white. And Laban says, okay, yeah, that's good. But Laban's a conniver too, right? So he tricks Jacob and he gives all the spotted sheep and all the black lambs and goats to his sons. And then he sends his sons far away. And so he's thinking he'll never get to go anywhere because he doesn't have any spotted anything now. And so there's kind of a bizarre story of how Jacob sets up some poles. He gets some white wooden poles and he takes the bark off of them. I guess they're probably dark, and he takes the bark off them, and now they have white stripes on them. And he sets those in front of the watering places so that those white goats and lambs, when they breed in front of these sticks, they actually have spotted offspring or black offspring. And of course, he only puts his sticks in front of the best of the flock. So he gets this super healthy flock of sheep that are spotted and black. And then all the white weaklings, he lets them breed normally. And so, you know, the white ones are getting smaller and weaker, and the spotted and black ones are getting stronger and bigger. And I just thought this was kind of an interesting thing. In England, they have a goat that they call or sheep. They call it the Jacob sheep, and you can see he's actually got 4 horns and he's spotted. And of course, his name came right from this story of Jacob taking all the spotted stuff. So Jacob has now created his spotted herd and his black herd, and he is ready to get out of there. And he's not going to tell Laban this time because it didn't work very well last time. He's just going to hit the road. And that's where chapter 31s and 32 go. Jacob is now heading for home. He's up in Haran where Abraham started. Now he's got to drop down south so that he can get back to the land of Canaan. And unfortunately for him, Laban is going to pursue him. not the reason is not given that it's because all of these goats and sheep that he took, though I'm sure that might have played a part in it. And of course, he took all of Laban's grandchildren with him too. But what really got to Laban is that his household gods were missing. And this just tells you what an edge these people walked along, right, in their relationship to God. There's the one God. He's trying to call them, he's trying to bless these wild animals basically and bring them back to him. And when they're talking face to face with him, they're pretty darn good about saying that they'll be loyal to him. But you know, you don't want to give up on your old gods either. So you keep household gods around. You keep some little pottery figures or wooden figures, and you worship them too, right? Not a good thing. But Rachel, when she's ready to leave, she also is not weaned of these idols, and so she steals the household gods. And that's what Laban really comes after. He wants his household gods back. And when he gets there, Jacob says, well, nobody here took your household gods. And Rachel is meanwhile scrambling to hide them in a camel saddle. And she sits down on the saddle, and Laban goes through everything. And finally, he comes to her, and she uses that age-old excuse of women. It's my period. I can't get up. And he's like, oh, I don't want to talk about those things. I'm out of here, you know? And so she gets away with it. He doesn't find out. And because what Jacob had said is if somebody stole it, you know, well, let's kill him, right? I didn't want anything stolen from you. But instead of any bloodshed, Laban and Jacob make a covenant, and each goes his own way, right? Laban still has a good herd. Jacob has his sheep and goats, and he's going to move back towards Canaan. On his way, right, he's getting nervous because Jacob was not very nice to his brother Esau. He stole his birthright, he stole his blessing. And so he's getting a little bit nervous. And as he starts out this journey, he's probably buoyed up a little bit in that he meets God's army of angels. And he meets them, and then he figures out maybe I can bribe Esau by sending little bands of goats and sheep ahead of me, and you know, some of my nice servants and stuff. I'll just send those off, and I'll send them as gifts to Esau. Well, he sends off the first bunch, and the servants come back to him and they say, hey, you know, Esau's hidden this way, and he's got 400 men with him, which is his own army. So Jacob probably realizes, man, I need that army of angels. But also in that chapter, we read chapter 32, while he's doing this, he falls asleep, and Jacob meets up with an angel of God. Or is it God? Or is it a man? Depending on what scholar you're reading and what faith he is, whether he's Jewish or Protestant or Catholic, they're going to claim different things, because in it, all this person that Jacob wrestles with is identified as all three. And the angel of God tells him that he's going to change his name from Jacob to Israel. And that's important because we all know there is still a state of Israel. And that state of Israel comes right back to this story, right? This is how Israel got its name, because Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and Jacob had 12 tribes, and the Jewish nation descended from those 12 tribes. we, however, if you read the footnote, it says the meaning of this passage remains obscure, but it does describe how Penuel got its name, face of God, right? Because Jacob fought with this angel, wrestled with this angel face to face, and so he saw God's face and he survived. Hence why many people will say, well, it was God he was wrestling with. And of course, the angel is really would be just be toying with him, as would God if it was God, or the pre-incarnate Christ. Oftentimes when we hear the angel of the Lord, right, that's the pre-incarnate Christ. But both angels and God are infinitely stronger than any human being. But it would be like playing with a child. But that angel does touch Jacob's hip. And we also learn why Jewish people don't eat the sinew on a hip, because Jacob's hip is kind of permanently displaced. And he limps away from this wrestling match. And even though he held on to this angel to get his blessing, because that's what he wanted to be blessed by this angel. And he said, well, I'll let you go if you bless me. And here is this divine creature who, all right, he's asking for my blessing. That's cool. And he does bless him. Chapters 33 and 34, here's a nice picture of Esau, the outdoors man, re-meeting Jacob. And Jacob is no fool, right? He's bowing down. He's got his whole family, all of his servants bowing down. He's got all these animals that he's gifted to Esau. And it works. The gifts work. And after they embrace and they reclaim their brotherhood, Esau heads for Seir and Jacob heads for Sukkoth. And Seir would be down below the Dead Sea. And Sukkoth, we're not really sure where it is. You'll see on one of the maps there in the back of your Bible that it's got a question mark by it. But we think it was kind of out towards the Nile Delta. And so they're heading different places because they both have big herds. But they are now reconciled. Well, Jacob, on his way to Sukkoth, decides to stop by Shechem and buy some land. And once again, you can see that deception runs in the human race, and it runs genetically. Jacob's daughter, Dinah, is grabbed by the person Shechem is named after. He is the son of the king of these pagans, and Shechem rapes Dinah. And when he also falls in love with her, right? She's beautiful. He just takes her, but he's in love with her. And he wants to marry her. And so he goes to his father and he says, can't we deal with this guy Jacob and all of his sons? And I just want their daughter for my wife. And Jacob's sons deceive this Hivite tribe, right? They say, oh yeah, you can have Dinah. You can have our sister, but we have this special covenant with God. And in order for our covenant to be binding, everybody has to be circumcised. So if you want to marry into our family, you have to be circumcised too. And the Hivites, right, they're like, oh man, this is a powerful people. Look at all the stuff they got. This would be a great union. It's a painful thing, but let's go ahead and circumcise all the men of the Hivite tribe. So they do that. And 3 days later, when you can imagine they would be very sore and hurting units, Jacob and Jacob's sons come back and they murder all the Hivite men. And they take their women captive and their children, and they take all of their animals. Again, you have got to realize what God was working with when he started calling back the human race. These were not friendly tribes. I mean, they were nasty, nasty warfare and nasty ways of killing each other and nasty ways of torturing. And so it's not a huge surprise when you read something like this. But Jacob, you're right, he's no fool. He's like, well, these other pagan tribes, they're going to hear what happened to the Hivites and the Canaanites and the Perizzites. They're going to seek revenge because they're not going to be happy that we did this. So we really need to leave this area. So God comes to Jacob and he realizes, whoa, they got themselves in quite the mess here. And he tells Jacob to go back to Bethel, to go to Luz, right? This is where Jacob already wrestled with this angel. So again, this is going to tell you something about what this people is like, because Jacob hears the words of God. He's like, okay, we got to go to Bethel. Everybody put away your foreign gods and purify yourself, right? They're supposed to be worshiping the one God, this God who's made all these promises to them. But you put away in all their saddlebags and hidden in their socks and our Lucky Charms and little idols and wooden statues. And Jacob's like, you gotta put all those things away. Go take a bath, purify yourself. We're gonna do what the one God says, right? And so again, we get the story of God changing Jacob's name to Israel. And this happens in Bethel, which was the city of Luz. And God renews his covenant again with Israel. So they're headed to Bethel, which is, probably about 10 miles north of Salem, because, right, Salem is going to become Jerusalem when it grows into a big city, but right now it's basically just a tiny little outpost. And Bethel's about 10 miles north of there. Well, Rachel, when she had Joseph, she asked God for another baby. She wanted to have another son. And God grants her that. He gives her Benjamin in addition to Joseph, but she dies in labor. And so Benjamin is born. And now Jacob has to bury his favorite wife, the wife that he really loved. And so he buries her either 10 miles north or 4 miles south of Jerusalem, because Bethlehem will become a city also. And it's not really clear whether Rachel was buried in Bethel or Bethlehem, but we know she was buried in that region. And she is going to be referred to again. You need to remember Rachel's name, and that Rachel died wanting a child and being given a child, right? And having children to her was just this enormous thing. And we hear about her in the prophet Jeremiah, and we hear about her in the New Testament, right? There is, you all turn in your Bible. Oh, there goes my phone. If you turn in your Bible to Matthew chapter 2, verse 18, it's on page 1270 of your Bible. So it's chapter 2, verse 18. And this is where it comes in really great to know the Old Testament, because this is right after the three wise men, and there's no three in the New Testament, but there are wise men who come from the East, and they're looking for the Christ child. And they know this star has risen, and they go to King Herod, and they say, hey, we're looking for this king. And Herod is, what king? What king are you looking for? And they're like, it's supposed to be under this star that we've been following. and we'll go find him. And Herod's like, when you find him, let me know where he's at, right? Well, they don't come back to him. They keep going because they know he's up to no good. And the wise men do find the Christ child, and they go on their way. And then Herod is beside himself. They told him that the child would be born in Bethlehem. And so he decides he is going to murder all children underneath the age of 2 in Bethlehem. And so he does that. And we'll start with verse 17. It says, "Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah." Ramah was a city that's found in the part of the chosen land that was given to Benjamin's tribe, right? Benjamin is the baby she died having. Ramah is a city that was in Benjamin. So a voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they were no more. So a name to remember, because we'll cover that again when we get to the New Testament. And then, yikes, another kind of ishy story. Reuben, his oldest son from Leah, lies with his father's concubine, Bilhah, who had 2 of his children too. And of course, Reuben's name is now very tarnished in his father Jacob's eyes. Now, Jacob makes his home near Bethlehem, but he goes to Hebron when his father Isaac dies. And we'll hear more about that in another chapter. Then chapter 36, we get the genealogy of Esau, right? Esau took Hittite wives. He took Ishmael's daughter as a wife. He had all sorts of children who had children who had children. And we read about that genealogy in chapter 36. And it's important because it's the genealogy of the Edomites. And the Edomites will become a pain in the side for the chosen people. There'll be a lot of fighting between them. So now we are ready to get to the story of Joseph, right? Joseph is the first son of Rachel and Jacob, and his 10 brothers hate him. And we get into this story in chapter 37 when Joseph is about 17 years old. And his brothers hate him, number one, because he's dad's favorite, right? His dad loved Rachel most. So when she had Joseph, he became dad's favorite, and only followed by Benjamin, who was also born to Rachel. He's so much a favorite that his dad makes him a special coat. It has long sleeves, it's a long jacket, it's made out of the best leather, it doesn't have many colors, but somehow, some way, it became a coat of many colors in the movie production. But it was really just a really, really nice leather coat. His brothers hate him because he rats to his father on his brothers. He tells his father what schmucks they are and that they don't behave very well. And they hate him because he has 2 different dreams. In the first one, each of the brothers has a sheaf of grain, right? A kind of a cone or a shaped like I can't even think of the word I'm trying to think of, but a sheaf. It's tied in the center and it's wider at the top and the bottom. And in this dream, all of their sheaves bow down to him. Well, that turks him off. And then he even gets his father going because he has another dream. And he says, "Oh, I saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars with them, and they all bowed down to me." Well, now his dad, Jacob, is like, your mom and I, we're not bowing down to you, so he kind of squashes this. But his brothers don't forget that. So in the story, the brothers, all half brothers, all head off to keep the herd, and Joseph is sent to check on them by his father. And when they see him afar, they're like, let's kill him. We hate the guy anyway. Let's just kill him. Well, Reuben actually has some sense about him and some compassion. And so he suggests, no, let's just put him in a dry well, and we'll deal with him, we'll just leave him there. And he's thinking, we'll leave him in the dry well, but then I'll come back and save him. But in the meantime, they decide, they see a bunch of traders going by, Ishmaelites, and they're like, let's just sell him. Let's sell him and send him to Egypt. Another brother comes up because he's also a little squeamish about killing his brother. So instead, they sell him to these Ishmaelite traders, and they take that really good looking coat you can see right here on the screen, and they take it back to his father Jacob, who's also named Israel, and they say, oh, Joseph got eaten by wild animals. And of course, it breaks his father's heart, right? That's his favorite son. And it's pretty clear from the blood smeared all over this coat that something terrible has happened to Joseph. In chapter 38, right, we're in the middle of the story of Joseph, but he's on the road to Egypt right now. He's with the Philistine, or with the Ishmaelite traders. He's being headed off to Egypt. So let's turn to one of the other brothers of Leah, Judah. We get this spicy little story. We can't skip it because it's part of Christ's genealogy. Judah is the one of the 12 from whom King David will descend, and from King David's line, Jesus Christ will descend. So when we go to the New Testament, both at the beginning of Matthew and the beginning of Luke, we're gonna read about these people that were described back in chapter 38, Judah and Tamar, and what happens. So Judah marries a Canaanite woman, right? She's a pagan. And she has a baby by Judah, and they name him Er. But an Er marries this woman Tamar. But Er's a wicked guy, and so God slays him. So now Tamar's a widow. Well, back then, you didn't just leave young women who were widows that way. They needed to have children because that's how the inheritance would come through, right? They were married to this guy who had possessions. They now need to pass those possessions on. So what would happen was the brothers of the guy who died are responsible for giving this woman children, but the children won't belong to the brothers. They will officially belong to the deceased guy, even though the brother's the one who's got to feed the woman, he's got to feed the kids. He's not getting any credit for it, and they're not going to be in his army. They're going to be in the deceased guy's army, right? They're going to stay in that clan. Well, they don't really like doing that, right? It seems like taking a lot of responsibility, and they, just don't want to do it. So Judah's son Onan is told to become the father of Tamar's children, but he refuses. And we see the first artificial contraception in the Old Testament, where Onan goes into Tamar, but he has no intention of giving her children. So he withdraws and wastes all of his seed. He just shoots it onto the ground so that Tamar can't get pregnant. Well, God looks very unkindly at that, and he kills Onan. Well, now Judah's getting kind of, his heart's beating a little faster. He's got another son, but he doesn't really want to give her to Tamar because he gave her Er and he died, and he gave her Onan and he died. And so he doesn't want to give his third son Shelah to her. And but he doesn't say that. He says, "Oh, let's wait until Sheila grows up. He's a little young now for relations, right?" So Tamar's watching this from afar. She's sent back to her own family, and she sees Sheila grow up, and she knows he's old enough, but he's not going to be given to her, and she knows it. So meanwhile, the Canaanite woman that Judah married dies. So Judah's widowed now, and he decides to go shear some sheep for his friend. So he hits the road, and Tamar knows the road he's going to take. And so she dresses up like a harlot, and she makes sure, though, that her face is covered so he won't know who it is. So he decides that he's going to hire this harlot for sex. So he has sex with her without knowing it's his daughter-in-law. And then he says, "Well, what am I going to pay you?" And he says, "How about a calf or a kid from my flock?" She was like, "Yeah, that sounds good, but what are you going to give me so that I have something while you get this kid and get it sent to me?" And she says to him, "This is what I want. I want your staff, I want your signet ring, and I want your cord." Right? His staff is a personalized staff. It would have been hand carved. She wants his signet. It's a ring that has a mark on it that when you officially are going to sign something, you put wax down and you put your ring in it, and it makes a mark, and that mark is your mark. That's your signature. And he gives her cord, a piece of fabric that goes around your neck. And every man had his own type of cord that was handmade for him and its own design. So all these things will identify them as belonging just to him. But he's okay with it. He's going to send this kid back and get him back. Well, so he gets the kid, he sends it back with his friend, but everybody's like, "There's no harlot around here. There was never a harlot on the road. We didn't see any harlot." And so he's, Judah's like, "Oh, I don't care. It's a big deal, I guess I'll just keep my kid." But then he hears that his daughter-in-law, Tamar, is pregnant. And he's furious. How dare she get pregnant by somebody outside of our family? And so he's going to kill her. He's going to have her stoned, which would be the punishment. But instead, Tamar presents him with these items and says, "This is the father of my baby." And he immediately knows, right? These are mine. This is my baby. Well, it's not just one baby, it's two babies. She has twins. Their names are Perez and Zerah. We get kind of another story of these twins. One sticks his hand out of the birth canal and the midwife ties a scarlet ribbon around it, but then the hand pops back in and the other child is born first. That other child is Perez. And it's going to be Perez who carries on the covenant. Perez is going to have a son named Boaz. Boaz is going to have another beautiful story written around his wife. And we will see Tamar, Judah, and Perez mentioned by name in one of the genealogies. And in the other genealogy, we see Perez's name, but we know that he came from Tamar. So there's an interesting little story in the midst of everything else. Now back to Joseph, right? He was with these Philistine traders. He's on his way to Egypt. And when he gets there, Joseph is sold to Potiphar. And Potiphar is a very powerful man. And Joseph is a tremendous servant to him. And Potiphar trusts him with everything in his household. Well, but Joseph's handsome. He's this handsome Jewish youth that Potiphar's wife looks at him and thinks, "Whoa, I would like to have him in my bed." So she tries to seduce him. But Joseph is a good guy. And he says, my master, he trusts me with everything, even you. I am not going to have sex with you. And that torques off Potiphar's wife. And so she's trying to seduce him, and he's telling her no. And she grabs at him, and she grabs his clothes, and they come off in her hands. And he runs out the door naked, and she starts screaming like he was trying to rape her instead of vice versa. And so Joseph ends up in prison. But of course, even in prison, he's the model prisoner. And so the guy who keeps the prison puts him in charge of everything. And Joseph has this special gift from God. He can interpret dreams. And Pharaoh fires his butler and his baker, and they end up in this prison. And they both have some dreams, and kind of nightmarish dreams, but Joseph is asked to interpret them. And so he tells the butler that, your dream means that you're going to go back to the Pharaoh and you're going to be his butler again, and everything's going to work out super for you. And then he tells the baker tells him his dream, and he's like, yeah, man, you're going to get hung up and the birds are going to eat your head. And those two things come true. The butler goes back to Pharaoh, the baker gets killed by Pharaoh. But as the butler's going, Joseph yells to him, hey, wait, tell Pharaoh about me. Well, the butler had good intentions, but he got back. He forgot about Joseph. Right up until the time the Pharaoh had a dream. He had two dreams, actually. First, he dreamed of 7 big, huge, fat cows, but then 7 skinny little cows came up and ate the fat cows. And then he had another dream about 7 big, fat ears of corn and 7 shrunken up, shriveled, almost husks of corn come and eat up the big fat corn. And none of his magicians, none of his soothsayers can tell him what those dreams mean. And now all of a sudden the butler remembers, hey, there was a guy in prison. His name was Joseph. He interpreted dreams. So Pharaoh calls for him, and Joseph interprets his dream. He tells him the fat corn, the fat calves were 7 years of plenty. And the skinny corn and the skinny cows, those were 7 years of famine. And he says to him, you're going to have to find somebody really smart and have them go and take 20% during all the fat years and store it up so that you can feed people during the years of famine. And Pharaoh's like, you seem pretty smart. I pick you. And I'm making you second in command in Egypt. You're second only to me. And so they're able to forestall the famine in Egypt. Well, the famine is not just happening in Egypt. It's happening back up where Joseph's family lives in Canaan. So Joseph's brothers are going to end up bowing to him, right? They're starving. They're going to starve to death. So Joseph's father decides to send the rest of his sons, except Benjamin, down to Egypt to get some grain. And when they get there, Joseph recognizes his brothers, but they don't recognize him, right? He looks like an Egyptian now. He dresses like an Egyptian. He walks like an Egyptian. He talks like an Egyptian. I think they might have written a song about this, right? So they don't know who he is, but they do know that they need to buy grain. Well, he asks them some questions. He asks, well, how's your father doing? Do you have any other brothers, right? And they say, oh, Dad's good. He's back home. We have 2 other brothers, but one of them is deceased, and the other, he's my father's favorite, and he just wasn't allowed to come. Well, Joseph's like, oh no, you're all spies, right? Yeah, I'm not going to let you guys go. And then there's conversation about it. And Joseph, of course, he wants his blood brother back. So he says, I'm going to let you go. However, one of you has to stay with me, and he will not be released until you bring this younger brother of yours back. So he gives them the grain, but he sneaks their money. He has his people put the money back into the sacks of grain, which is what we see over in this picture over here, is money going back into the sacks of grain. And he keeps Simeon as a prisoner until they bring back Benjamin. So at the end of the chapter, they head back to Cana to tell their father that not only has he lost Joseph, but now Simeon is being held captive. And, you know, Jacob says, I'm not doing it. I'm not sending Benjamin. I lost Joseph. Now I've lost Simeon. I am not sending Benjamin. But Jacob's family runs out of food again. So he has to agree to let them take Benjamin to Egypt. And Joseph, again, now he recognizes all of them, and he recognizes this youngest one must be Benjamin, and he gives them grain. But this time he has not only money snuck back into their sacks, but a silver cup put in Benjamin's sack. And he is thinking, I'll just keep my blood brother right here with me. And so he sends his servants out after they leave to go back to their father. They open up their sacks. Once again, they discover they have the money, but now here comes all of Joseph's soldiers, basically. And they say, hey, somebody stole our master's silver cup. And they're like, no, nobody stole it. Nobody here. Well, they find it in Benjamin's sack. And so they know that the gig is up here. And Joseph accuses Benjamin and says he's going to keep him in Egypt. But then Judah comes to the fore, and Judah begs for Benjamin's release. He says, you know, if you keep this youngest one, my dad already lost his oldest son by Rachel. If you keep this youngest son by his favorite wife, I don't think his health will hold up. So that breaks Joseph. He fesses up now. He tells them that he's their brother. But at first, they're actually really afraid, right? This is a brother they threw into a well and were going to kill, and then they sold him to traders. So they're terrified. But Joseph, he tells them that they completed God's plan. If they hadn't betrayed him, he could have never saved them or so many other people from this great famine. So of all the people who has really stayed faithful to God, it's Joseph down here in Egypt. And he sees, even though he suffered a great deal and he had no idea where God was taking this while he was being, you know, accused of raping a woman that he didn't even want to have sex with, and then he's thrown in prison and he's left there for a long time, and you know, he suffered a lot, but he now saw that this was God's plan, that this is how God was going to save his family. So he tells them, go get Pop and go get everything else that's up there in the land of Canaan and bring it down here to Egypt, because this famine is not over. And I got an in with the Pharaoh. He'll give us some fertile land. And Pharaoh did. Pharaoh gave them land in Goshen, which is right there on that Nile Delta, super rich farmland, great grazing land. And so they go get Dad. Jacob, their father, lives there for 17 years. And right, they're prospering. Their herds are getting huge. They're having lots of kids. Everything is going great for them here in Goshen. But Jacob says, don't bury me down here, right? This is not the promise that God made to us. This is not the land that is going to become ours. Already Abraham and our other patriarchs, our other fathers are buried where we're supposed to be. And they make him that promise. So then in chapter 48 and 49, Jacob is now an old man after 17 years. He's up there, and he calls to Joseph. Joseph, when he came to Egypt and after he became second in command, he took an Egyptian wife, and he has two sons by her. Their names are Ephraim and Manasseh. And the oldest is, of course, supposed to get the blessing. But Jacob kind of pulls the same thing he pulled with Esau, right? He is going to cross his hands, and you see that in the picture, because Joseph brought his oldest son and put him on his right side. That would be the one who would get the primary blessing, the oldest child, and then whatever was left over goes to the younger child. But no, Jacob reverses his hands, and he says, this is God's way. This is what God wants to happen. And so he reverses the order, just as Jacob and Esau were reversed. And then if you take a look in your Bible, in chapter 49, you're going to see that Judah's blessing is a little bit more special than anybody else's. If you look in your Bible, it would be on page 81. So it would be Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 12. Now listen to Judah's blessing. Each of the sons is getting a blessing. Ephraim and Manasseh are now considered sons of Isaac. They were blessed first. And then here's Judah's blessing. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he lurked as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. Right? Who is this person to whom this scepter is going to belong? It's going to be Jesus. That's who it's going to be. And to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. You could also say it might be David. This could be a description of David, right? They're both in that line. Binding his foal to the vine and his donkey's colt to the choice vine. Remember Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey? He washes his garments in wine and his vestures in the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine and his teeth white with milk, right? Judah is going to be the line through whom David and then Christ descend. And you see that in his blessing. Only one of the other blessings am I going to really kind of look at, just because it's Benjamin's blessing, the second son of Rachel's that she died giving birth to. On page 82 in chapter 49, verse 27, it says, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and in the evening dividing the spoil. Well, Benjamin, in his line will come St. Paul, right? St. Paul came out of the genealogy of Benjamin. So, and you will hear St. Paul tell us that. And then Jacob makes them promise to bury him in the cave at Machpelah with Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah. Oops, and look who else is there. Leah, the ugly one, right? The one with the weak eyes. She was the one, she bore him 6 sons, and she is the mother of Judah, and Judah is going to be in the line of David. So remember that cave at Machpelah I showed you a picture of how a basilica first was built over it, and then a mosque. And then in the 6-Day War, it was turned into a mosque and a Jewish temple. And then there was a terrible shooting there. Well, those are the bones of the people, right? Jacob says, take me back there. And Pharaoh grants this wish. In chapter 50, Pharaoh lets Joseph, his second in command, go to bury his father Jacob, who also has the name Israel, back in the cave at Machpelah. And then Joseph forgives his brothers again, right? His brothers, now that dad is gone, his brothers get scared. They're like, we really treated Joseph terribly. And now that dad's gone, maybe he's going to take it out on us. And we talk about types, right? In the Old Testament, we've mentioned it several times before. Joseph's mercy towards his brother is a type of the mercy that God shows to all of us. If you read in chapter 50, starting with verse 15, this is what it says. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil which we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, forgive, I beg you, the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now we pray you, forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Fear not, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he reassured them and comforted them. That passage reminds me of the confessional, the sacrament of reconciliation, right? You go before the priest who's acting in the person of Christ, and you tell him the evil that you've done in your life. And he brings you back into Christ's love. He forgives those sins in the person of Christ, right? He is just being the mouthpiece for Christ in heaven. And there is nothing better than the sacrament of confession. If you don't go to confession, I would beg you to do it. And remember this passage out of chapter 50. Joseph always also tells them that God will visit them and bring them out of Egypt to the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So he, as before, remember we already had a prophecy that they were going to become slaves in Egypt. And so he doesn't tell them they're going to be slaves, but he does tell them that God's going to send somebody to bring them out of Egypt and take them back to the promised land. And then he makes them promise to take his bones with him, right? He's going to die and he doesn't want to stay. He doesn't want his bones to stay in Egypt. Where does he want them to go? Back to the cave at Machpelah. Joseph is the last one that we will hear, the last of the patriarchs who will be buried in that cave. But if you take a look here at this map that's in your book, oops. Let's see if I can actually go backwards. I can, I just have to remember how. There is a map in the back of your book, the tribal allotment of Israel, right? Jacob became Israel, and Israel had 12 sons by 4 different women. And when they do finally get back to the chosen land, they're going to divide up the chosen land into some for each of those tribes. And this is a picture of how they divide it up. Now you'll notice that there's no Joseph on here. Remember, because Joseph had his two sons that were adopted by Jacob, by Israel. And so instead, his two sons, Issachar and Manasseh, I do believe, were his two sons. No, Ephraim and Issachar, maybe. Anyway, his two sons are on here. You will not see the name of Levi, who was another son, because the Levites all became priests, and the priests weren't given big sections. They were given cities within the different places that their brothers were given. So that's all those names of all those sons you are going to see again and again in the Old Testament. So now we're finished with Genesis. Yay! And we're on to Exodus. So your readings for next week will be Exodus 1 through 12. And Chris's picks are Exodus 1 through 4 and chapters 11 and 12. But it's not a very big reading assignment this time, so hopefully you'll get it all done. And I will stop sharing now. And I will stop recording, and I'll see if there are any questions.